Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Karen Rawson. I'm the Vice President of the DESERA Group, and I want to thank you for joining us today to the ISO 9001 2015 Key Concepts series, where we'll cover scope and the process approach. While people are getting started, let's take a look at the GoToWebinar controls. I've been chatting with some of you. My name may show up as Dave Santacola because he's actually the account owner on this webinar, but I'll be doing the talking today. So that's me chatting to you about welcome to Oregon and welcome to Kentucky and so forth. So you can easily use that little orange arrow at the top to minimize the control panel there. You can expand the whole thing to be full screen if you'd like to see a bigger image on your screen. And we really encourage you to chat your questions to the staff in that lower box. Because we're being recorded, everyone's on mute, but we'll answer as many questions as possible at the end, and we'll also use those as input to our upcoming webinars. And now a little bit about DESERA. We have a deep history with ISO 9001 going back to 1987 when I was first implementing it in a medical device company, and I know my partner Dave Santacola was using it as an auditor not too long after that. And our speaker today certainly started getting involved around that time or not too much later, if implementing quality management systems and using management improvement techniques through Six Sigma and early process improvement methodologies using statistics. At DESERA, we help companies use standards and use Six Sigma and Lean to improve the quality of their business processes and the results for their customers. So our hope is that as we go through the year and you learn more about ISO 9001 2015 and you want to work on using this as an opportunity to truly upgrade your practices, that we'll be able to come in and help you out with some workshops, some management level training, with some auditors, internal audits, with some gap assessments, and certainly with the basic training that you may feel some of your team members need. You're in the right place in this webinar. If you are involved in any way in the ISO 9001 2015 transition, you may be a leader, you may be participating in a process as an individual contributor or as a process owner, or it may be that you're managing an organization that's covered by a certificate and you want to be sure that you're prepared to lead effectively. In this webinar, our presenter will be leading a number of, having several polls here where you'll have a chance to give your input on how a certain item affects you. So looking at the chickens and the pigs, we'd like to find out who's on the call today. Are you a chicken or a pig? And if you don't know the reference to the joke, that means when you look at a plate of bacon and eggs, are you the chicken, merely involved, or are you the pig, truly committed? Those of you who may be responsible for leading the changes are definitely in that pig role, and process owners may be truly committed to making the changes happen in a timely manner, and other people may be involved, be consulted and be informed. So let's take a look at the poll. The way you use this poll is you can select one of the answers on the page right now and give everyone a chance to make a click on that poll. Does it look like, oh, I launched the wrong poll. We're not going to be able to use that later on if I'm not careful here. Uh-oh. That was a preview of one of the polls that we were intending to use earlier on. So this one is about what is your role. No wonder nobody voted. What is your role? So would you be involved in leading the change, participating in making changes, managing in a certified organization, or you're just interested in learning more? So the poll is in progress, and now I see the votes coming in. This will help Joe have an idea of who's involved in this call today and maybe how to swing some of these. I'm seeing it come in heavily towards leaders of the changes, not so much for people who just decided to spend their lunch hour with DESERA. Here are the results of the poll. Not everyone got their vote in, but we've got about half the folks, about almost 90% of the folks involved in leading and participating in changes, and a smaller number are functioning as managers or some other role of interest. Okay, you've heard about ISO 9001 2015. If you're involved in leading or implementing changes, what kinds of things have you heard? Well, you probably know you need to start using it as soon as possible. And you've heard things like there's no required documents, and there's no quality manual, and then you've heard all these kinds of terms that are on the screen. We'll be covering these through our Key Concepts series in the coming months. Today, of course, we're just focusing on a couple of them. I'll show you some of the webinars we've done so far. At the end of October, beginning of November, we did a webinar on what's new. Joe led that one. Then in December, we did 6 steps to ISO 9001 2015 implementation. Those are currently on our website under the blog. They're available for download. And today's webinar will be available for at least 2 weeks to all the registered participants. But then we'll be doing a series of these webinars, each of which will be up for at least 2 weeks for download on our website. But at the end, we want your insight, your input into which one of these topics that you saw on the previous screen, and then some, should we choose to do in which order for our future webinars. So let's get into the content, ISO 9001 2015 scope and the process approach. Our speaker today is Senior Consultant and Lean Six Sigma Black Belt, Master Black Belt, Joe Barckett. I've had the pleasure of doing some internal audits and gap assessments with Joe. He's extremely analytical. With his mathematics background and his black belt background, he goes into detail on a company's process measures. So there's no better person than Joe in my mind to talk about the process approach, and as ISO 9001 rolls it out in this version, this 2015 version. Joe's had hands-on experience as a leader in consumer products company, and he's also had been in and out of many, many companies since the 80s as a consultant and as an employee. He's an engaging speaker and has such a broad knowledge base of quality. I know you'll enjoy his presentation today. So, Joe, let's get started with today's content.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you, Karen, for that wonderful introduction. As always, you do a good job for me. So our next item on the agenda is basically to start digging into some of the clauses and subclauses in the standard. And so we want to talk a little bit about 9001-2015, and specifically today's discussion is going to focus on 2 subsections of the standard. Clause 4.3, which is determining the scope of the quality management system, and Clause 4.4, the quality management system and its processes. In terms of the context of the organization, both of these clauses, 4.3 and 4.4, are part of the new section in 2015. Clause 4, context of the organization, is completely new. And there are 4 subclauses to these. 4.1, which is understanding the organization and its context. 4.2, which is understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. And the 2 we're going to spend time on today, 4.3, determining the scope of the QMS, and 4.4, quality management system and its processes. Now, while Clause 4 as a whole is new, the concept in both these 2 subclauses, 4.3 and 4.4, are very, very familiar to those of you that have been doing ISO 9001. They're not new to ISO. They're certainly not new to process improvement. In fact, they've been around for a long time. Let's start with Clause 4.3, determining the scope of the quality management system. It looks like 56% of you are going to be leading the change, and 32% of you are going to participate in making those changes. So most of you are, as the Karen would put it, you're part of the pig. You're not more of the chicken, you're more of the pig. You have some skin in the game. So as I said earlier, the term is not new. Scope of the quality management system is not new to the system, is not new to ISO. However, ISO 9000, the Rev in 2015, has no formal definition for that term. There is no formal definition in the Terms and Definitions document 9000 as to what the scope is. And in fact, ISO 9004, when it was revved in 2009, doesn't address it directly. So if we go to the dictionary, what we end up finding is that scope is the extent of the area or subject matter that something deals with, or to which it is relevant. And so that really applies to us. It makes some sense to us. It's asking us, what is the extent of your quality management system? And that's what we're here to talk about in this section 4.3. If we look back at 2008, the scope is mentioned in relation to the quality manual. In section 4.2.2 in the old standard, it says the organization shall establish and maintain a quality manual. Quality manual is no longer a requirement, by the way, but shall establish and maintain a quality manual that includes A, the scope of the quality management system, including details of and justification for any exclusions. But as I mentioned on the previous slide, there wasn't a lot of guidance or definition given to us here. And so we have to look a little bit deeper when we were in 2008 to understand what it is that they wanted us to write in terms of a scope. That's certainly not the case here in 2015. There's definitely more definition. The basic answer to what's new is that they've better defined what needs to be in the scope. Specifically, if we start looking at the details, the first sentence in 4.3 talks about the organization shall determine the boundaries and applicability of the quality management system. Basically, we want to understand what's in our system and what's not in our system. What this system applies to, what our QMS system applies to, and what it doesn't apply to. As we go through the bullet points, you'll see that they get a little more specific, clearly a lot more specific than they did in 2008. So let's head over to the first bullet point. The first bullet point says we need to consider issues both internal and external. And those are the issues that were referred to in 4.1. Just when you thought you were done with 4.1, understanding the context of the organization, here it is, it pops up again. You know, some of these issues could be technology related, some of them could be market related, some of them could even be culturally related in terms of what the business. Whatever we've defined in 4.1 as that context, this part of the standard wants us to consider those as we write the scope. We want to make sure that when we've written the scope, we've taken those issues that we think, that we've said, that we know have an importance to the context of the organization into context ourselves. The second bullet provides a little more definition, and it talks about relevant interested parties. Well, guess what? They were referenced in 4.2. These are the internal as well as the external parties that we listed under understanding the needs and expectations. Suppliers, customers, employees, all those internal and external groups that are relevant to QMS. As we develop or redevelop the scope, we want to make sure that we've taken these needs and expectations of those relevant parties into consideration. This shows up a lot when we deal with exclusions. For example, I can't exclude traceability if one of my relevant parties, specifically a customer, has a requirement on me that I have traceability on my product or service. And so in this part of the standard, what they're saying is make sure as you write your scope, you take those needs and expectations of the relevant interested parties into that scope definition. The third bullet provides, again, a little more definition, and it refers to products and services of the organizations. One of the changes that we've seen in the standard is it no longer just lists the word products. Wherever the word products appears, it's in conjunction with products and services. And that's, again, to make it more applicable to those companies that aren't in the manufacturer. Here's an example where you may have a prototype department that you don't include in your quality management system. Maybe it's a best efforts design and development or prototype for your customer. And so in some cases, you may exclude products and or services from the scope of your quality management system. Moving on to the next sentence, it talks about once we've determined our scope, then all the requirements of the standard applies to that scope if they are applicable within the determined scope of the quality management systems. Those products or services that are within that scope. And so the second part talks a little bit about exclusions. We're starting to hint at what might we exclude in the scoping of our quality management system. And that brings us to some of that discussion. But first we have to deal with another sentence. And that sentence talks about availability and maintenance. The scope of the organization's QMS shall be available and maintained as documented information. Now we're going to talk a little bit about maintained versus retained as documented information when we get in section 4.4. But basically what they're trying to tell us here is that the scope of the system has to be available for people to look at. You determine who those folks are. And it has to be maintained. and it has to be maintained so that it gets reviewed on a regular basis. The scope shall also state the types of products and services that it covers. The second part of that sentence gives us some of the wording for exclusions. It says, and provide justification for any requirement of this national standard. Now, exclusions aren't new to us. We've done them before in 2008. And so what we're trying to get out of this is we want to make sure that we understand what requirements in the standard apply and what requirements don't apply. If we believe there are requirements that don't apply, then we have to provide justification as to how it's not applicable to the scope of this quality management system. So I want to take another quick poll, but we'll do it in a different way. In your question box that you have over there, or chat box, whichever one you have available to you, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to type in which exclusions, if any, you currently take. So go to your questions box and start typing those exclusions in for us. And they can be the old types of exclusions we've seen before. It can be design and development exclusions. It can be customer property exclusions. It can be calibration, traceability, or there may not be any exclusions at all. The whole standard may be applicable to your quality management system. All right, while you're doing that, let's talk about this last sentence in that paragraph. It continues to talk about exclusions, and basically what it says is conformity to the standard. In other words, in order for you to say you conform to this international standard, the exclusions cannot affect the organization's or responsibility to ensure conformity of its products and services. New wording here, and services and the enhancement of customer satisfaction. This is more words that were in 2008. These words were not in 2008, especially the enhancement of customer satisfaction. Now, if I look at the types of exclusions you've typed in here, calibration, design and development, these are pretty standard exclusions. Customer property, ESD, typical of all the things we've had in the past. The exclusions in 2015 are not limited to any one clause. All of the exclusions you listed will continue to be allowed in the 2015 standard. And so in 2008, the exclusions were limited to specifically Clause 7. Section 1.2 stated that the exclusions can only be taken to those requirements in Clause 7. That's not the case here. They've spread things around a little differently. And so the exclusions that were in the requirements that were in Clause 7 for 2008 aren't all in one clause anymore. And so wherever those exclusions exist, you can take them provided you have good justification for that. Let's see, anything else we can see? Multi-site, they have some exclusions depending upon the sites. That makes sense. So I see nothing that's unusual in terms of what exclusions have happened before. All right, that's good. This last slide here in this section talks about a tool that we'll make available to you. Karen will actually make this available to anyone who needs it. And this is an is-not tool. We use this type of tool when we scope Lean Six Sigma projects. And so it's fairly useful in doing any scoping. And the scoping for your quality management system is something we can use it for. We've got 5 different categories on the left-hand side, and we've got 2 different columns, is what's in scope and is not what's out of scope. The geographic category are for those companies that have multiple locations. Maybe they're only going to do the location in Rhode Island, and they have locations in Massachusetts and Connecticut and California. And so they would put the Rhode Island location, and the is not piece would be the California and the Massachusetts. The department, organization, or even specific division could be listed next. You know, yeah, we've got 5 divisions in Rhode Island, but we're only going to look at having one of those divisions. You know, Division A located in Providence. We're not going to worry about divisions B, C, or D in Warren, in Newport, or in wherever the other third location might be. So the geographic piece is for those companies that have a large multi-site company, and they can scope it down to the specific organization that they want this quality management system to apply in. We can do the same for the products and services. Clearly, not all of your products have to be in your quality management system. You make that decision. So the is, what's the product or service line that we're dealing with, and what's the is not, what is going to be out of scope. The third row deals with processes, and we're going to talk a lot more about processes when we get into the process approach. So we can list the specific processes that are going to be in scope. When Karen talked about the 6 steps to transition, the second step was putting a matrix together of the requirements of the standard against your processes in your organization and seeing which requirements bounced up against which processes. If none of those requirements affect some of those processes probably aren't going to be in your scope. And so we can probably leave them out of scope, and this is a methodology for you to list them. So go back to that matrix when you're doing this is not tool. The last 2 rows deal with interested parties. What interested parties are we going to have in scope for our quality management system? What interested parties are we going to have out of scope? There may be interested parties like surrounding community that aren't going to be in scope of your quality management system. And then the last row deals with the requirements of each of those interested parties. So this tool will be made available to you. Utilize it any way you want. Put your names on it, change it, add rows, add columns, however you want to do it. It'll be an open tool for you to utilize. One of the things we told you we talk about is what should you do. You know, in our last webinar, Karen spoke about 6 different steps to ISO 9001-2015 transition. Understanding the content, putting a matrix together. HLP was for high-level plan, having a kickoff. Step 5 was the specific actions that need to be taken, and step 6 was actually doing the audits. In terms of what we think you should do from the information we've given you already, is to add this scope review or scope determination, depending upon where you're at with certification, into the high-level plan. You know, one of the things that has to be done is the scope has to be either created or reviewed. And then detail the actions necessary to do that in step 5, the actions list. You may want to revert back to step 2, the matrix, where you've seen the processes against the standard requirements, to make sure that you're covering all the processes that you need to cover. You know, what's applicable, what processes are applicable to our quality management system. So that's how it fits in, and that's what we think you should do moving forward with section 4.3, determining the scope of the quality management system. All right. We have another poll out there that I'm going to ask Karen to go ahead and implement, and while she's doing that, I'll talk.
Joe, that was where I goofed at the beginning, where I accidentally launched that poll, and it won't let me launch it a second time. So let's have people just chat their answers on this one.
Okay, so then chat for us and tell us, based on the information you've heard, do you think your organization should consider making any changes to its current scope of registration? Yeah, we should take a look. Yeah, our scope's pretty general. No, our scope is well defined already. We don't have to do any work with it. I'm not sure. And then lastly, we don't even have an organization certification yet, therefore I'm not going to be worried about it. So use your chat or your question box there, and I'll let Karen go through some of those, and if she wants to raise some issues, we're welcome to do that as we go through the slides moving forward. That brings us to the next clause, and that clause is 4.4, subclause actually, 4.4, Quality Management System and its Processes. This is starting to talk about the process approach. And so we'll talk a little bit about what's new here. We'll talk again about what's changed. And then clearly we'll talk a little bit about what you should do moving forward. So what's changed? Well, process management isn't new to the standard. Process management has been around for a while, and since the 87 or actually 90 Rev or so, 92 Rev, whatever that second Rev was, we've talked about the process management. And we wanted you to look from the internal audit point of view as well as from the management point of view at your organization as a series of processes. And so from the internal audit point of view, what we really wanted you to do is we wanted you to think about how your organization was designed, think about the processes that actually make up your services or your production, and then audit not by clause of the standard, but audit by process. So process management isn't new to us. It was discussed in 2008, and in fact, come on, where'd you go? It was in the 0.2, the introduction process approach, and it talked about how this international standard promotes the adoption of a process approach. And so they promoted it there. It wasn't a requirement at that point. But now it is now part of the requirements, and it's part of the requirements in Clause 4.4, Quality Management System and its processes. If we look at subclause 4.4.1, it states that the organization shall establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve your quality management system. So this is the general piece. It tells us in general what we need to do with our quality management system. The second half of that sentence says, including the processes needed and their interactions. Now, we've seen the interactions piece before, and we'll see it again a little bit further on in the slides. But the piece we haven't seen a lot of is including the processes needed. And so what they're telling you again is with that scope of the organization, the scope of your quality management system, what processes are going to be in your QMS. And those processes need to be established, implemented, maintained, and continually improved. And so 441 takes us in that direction. The interaction piece is important. Again, it was part of 2008, and it has somewhat of a reference. It starts to have a discussion a little bit about that system approach. Now, for those of you that are very familiar with the old standard, you remember that the 2008 standard was based on 8 quality management principles. 2 of those principles were, one of them was the process approach, and a secondary one was the systems approach. Well, the new standard, the 2015 standard, they've based it on only 7 quality principles. They've actually taken out the system approach. I'm not sure I agree that that's a good takeout, but they've done it. One of the reasons that I like the system approach is that it forces us not just to look at processes by themselves, but it forces us to look at this interaction piece. And this line in Clause 441, including the processes needed and their interactions, similarly does that. It makes us look at what are the interactions between the individual processes that we have in our quality management system. The next paragraph has a series of bullets, A through G, so we'll go through them one at a time and explain a little bit about what each of those have. It starts off with the sentence that says, the organization shall determine the processes needed. We've already done that, hopefully. In writing your scope, you've looked at your processes, you've looked at your clauses, and you see which processes are needed for my quality management system. Bullet A says, determine the inputs and outputs for these processes. This is new for us. So not only does it say we need to know what processes are in our QMS, but it now says for those processes we shall determine the inputs required and the outputs expected from these processes. Now, you have a say, obviously, into how granular you describe your processes. You know, do you want to do it as one big process? We pull in raw material and we ship product out the end. Probably not likely. You're probably going to break it down into some high-level processes. For those high-level processes, you're going to be required to have what are the inputs required for those and what are the outputs expected. And as it travels through your high-level process, what you'll see is that the outputs of one are the inputs of the other. And that's to be expected as we do most of the process improvement work. This was implied in 2008, but it wasn't a strict requirement for us to deal with the inputs and outputs. Bullet B talks about that sequence and interaction. This was a standard requirement in 2008, and it shows up here again. We've touched upon it once, the interaction piece in the first or second sentence. And so now we see that the standard wants us to make sure that not only do we understand the processes, but we understand the system. And so going back to my discussion about the system approach, in our Lean Six Sigma projects, whenever we do any business process improvement, we always talk about balanced metrics. So we refer to them as P, F, Q, and T. Productivity, F for financial, Q for quality, T for timeliness. Hang with me, I'll tie it into this interactions piece eventually. What we try and do is we make sure that the green belt or the black belt who's running that project has listed at least one of each of those types, a productivity measure, a quality measure, a financial measure, and a timeliness measure. If they're only focusing on quality for that project, say they want to improve the capability, they want to improve the sigma value of that process, and they didn't track anything else, then they could improve the sigma value of the process. They could reduce the number of defects, increase your yield, but at what expense? And so we ask them to measure at least one in each of those four categories. I can improve quality, but increase my cost to such an extent that I go out of business, and I don't want to do that. That is what the system and the interaction approach is talking about. I'm going to improve process A, but I can't do that in a vacuum. While I change process A, I need to know how does that interact with the downstream and the upstream processes. I don't want to play whack-a-mole. I don't want to hit one down and another one pop up over here. And so this sequence and interaction is an attempt for the standard to make you start thinking about not only the processes, but how those processes relate to each other. Continual improvement is throughout this standard, as it was in 2008. And we're going to be continually improving processes and products and services. And unless we understand how those interact, we can't do it in a vacuum, because if we do it in a vacuum, we may be negatively affecting downstream or upstream processes. And so that's the concept that we're trying to get at in this section B. What is the sequence and interaction of these processes? Hopefully I made the connection for you. This is a very typical sequence and interaction chart. Represented by management processes at the top. We've got our core processes in the middle. This is what actually production does or service provides. And then we have our support processes down at the bottom. It shows a little bit of the interaction. What it's lacking is the inputs and outputs and a few other things that A through G are going to tell us that we need to have on this. But it's a good high-level look at how your process as management, core, and support flow in your organization. One of the things I tell people that I'm training and people that I'm consulting with is make this chart usable for people in your organization. This should be a roadmap for a new employee to understand how the process works overall and where they fit. You know, I'm in the order management process, so I can see I fit in the order management piece over here. And my suppliers are the production process, and my customers internal are the service and repair process. So make this a usable chart for you. It's also a good way to meet the requirement of the standard for sequence and interaction. All right, continuing on down to these bullets, bullet C talks about determining and applying the criteria and methods needed to assure the effective operation. So what are we going to do to monitor, to measure, and what are the related performance indicators we're going to have in place on these processes? Remember, the organization shall determine the processes, and they shall determine and apply the criteria and methods. This used to be in clause 8.2 of the old standard, monitoring and measuring. And in 8.2.3 and 8.2.4 back then, we talked about monitoring product and monitoring processes. Again, we see that the standard is headed towards focusing on performance, because now they're telling us that we've got to monitor and measure process performance. When we do that, we focus on effectiveness, and that's really what we're up for here. Why we got certified is we want our processes to be more effective. We want to be more customer focused. If we move on to D, D states in part determine the resources needed for these processes. This was in Clause 6 of the old standard, the 2008. However, the second part of this bullet has a few new words in it, and it states ensure their availability. What good is having the resources determined if we don't have them available? Resources here are the resources we've always talked about. They're the people, the machines, computer programs, all those items that are needed by the process to run effectively. Fifth bullet, bullet E, says assign the responsibilities and authorities for these processes. Who are the process owners? We've identified the process. Who owns that? What are their responsibilities as it relates to that process that they own? Today we do this typically through job descriptions, organization charts, and in some sense annual reviews or semi-annual reviews, the review process in general. So not only do we have to understand what processes are in QMS, but we now have to make sure we've identified who's responsible for each of those processes and what authorities do they have. Bullet F says address the risks and opportunities as determined in accordance with the requirements of 6.1. This is new because risk is new, and it's in line with the added risk management requirement that we're going to run into when we do our key concept on risk for Clause 6. But that's a whole other webinar, and we'll be putting that one on soon for us. Basically here, what they want you to do is to look at the risk you've identified to these processes, if there are any, and make sure that they get addressed. And they get addressed as you see fit. And so when we talk about risks, you're going to have a lot of leeway in how to identify those risks, how to prioritize those risks. There's been no requirement given to us in the standard as to what tool you need to use or how detailed that tool needs to go. The old consultant saying of do what's right for the business clearly applies here. And so whatever you do for the business, however you identify those risks and opportunities to the processes, this part of the standard wants to make sure that you address those. Prioritize them. They're not expecting you to do them all at once, so you need to prioritize them somehow and then start clicking them off one at a time. Again, we'll talk a lot more about risk in an upcoming key concept. And when we get to the end of this seminar, this webinar, you'll have the ability to say, that's one I want to see quickly, or that's one I want to put off. We'll be able to understand from one of the polls we're going to do eventually how critical this one is to you or not. We're almost there. Hang in. Next to the last bullet, G, evaluate these processes and implement any changes needed to ensure they achieve their intended results. Bullet C said we got to monitor and measure it. Well, it's not good enough just to collect data anymore. Now we have to do something with it. We have to evaluate these processes, and how we evaluate them typically is with the data we've collected. We want to make sure that in that evaluation that they're achieving intended results. And then finally, the last bullet for us, or the next to the last bullet maybe, is this the last one? Yeah, that is the last one. The last bullet says not only do we have to assure the processes achieve the intended results that they were put in place for, but here's the improvement piece again. The organization shall improve those processes and the quality management system. So once again, we see performance, we see improvement. These are two concepts that were in the old standard, and they've made their way back into this new 2015 here. The good news is that if we've done what a lot of the other bullets have said we should do, then there will be data available for us to look at to help us prioritize what continual improvement activities we're going to do and when. Again, the standard's not expecting you to work on everything all the time. That's not the intent. But it expects you to have some improvement process in place, and part of that improvement process would be to prioritize what it is that you work on. How do you prioritize it? You get data. And so bullet C said, let's go get some data. Next to the last bullet said, let's evaluate it. This bullet says, now let's improve those processes. So let's prioritize them, and let's make sure we know what methodology we're going to be doing that. This next thing is fairly new, but it's not a new requirement. And what it is, it's the standard has two new graphics. They're both in the introduction section, point 3 process approach. This one you might be familiar with It's basically the sources, inputs, activities, outputs, and receivers graphic. For those of you that have done any Lean Six Sigma, you might recognize this as the SIPOC map: S for suppliers, I for inputs, P for process, O for outputs, and C for customers. And so what they're trying to do with this graphic is pull together a lot of the requirements in A through G. The inputs are represented here, the outputs are represented here, some of the interested parties are represented here, and even some of the controls are here. However, there are things missing. Resources are missing, responsibilities are missing, and the risks to the processes are missing. So it's not a new concept, and it's not a requirement that you utilize this format, but it is a way for you to start looking at your processes and meeting those requirements A through G. Another way to do that is a typical process management worksheet. Here's one version of that tool, and this covers basically all of A through G with the exception of the risk piece. So it's got the inputs over on the left-hand side, materials information, who the suppliers to those inputs are, what the requirements are. It's got the outputs, who the customers are, what their requirements may be. It lists performance standards. What are we going to measure? Who defines them? What are the requirements of those measures? It's got process owners, not necessarily responsibilities, but at least ownership. Facilities and equipment, training and knowledge. Some of you may remember this as the turtle diagram from way back when we started doing ISO 9000. It's gotten a little bit more detailed, and it has a lot more information involved on it. All right, so let's go back and see. Karen, are you going to do another poll on this one? No, we don't.
No, we didn't have a poll lined up.
So let's use the question box here then and have you rank for me on a scale of 1 to 5 how you think your organization is doing with the process approach. So go back to the question box, and on a ranking of 1 to 5, 1 being basically that we've barely started on the process approach, and 5 being that it's working very effectively for us. And give us some information in the question box for us so we can understand a little bit about where you're at with this. I've got a lot of customers that have done a lot of work using this process management worksheet, and it really clarifies for them all the things that they need to understand about each and every process that's in their quality management system. While you're doing that, I'll share with you the other.
Joe, would you repeat that question? I think as I see these coming in, I know some people are saying, wait a minute, was 1 low or was 1 high? Tell us again.
So 1 is very low. It's that we've barely started with the process approach. And 5 is very high. It's been working very effectively for us. We use it a lot. All right, and somewhere in between a 1 through a 5 gives us a good.
You know, Joe, as I'm going down this list, I'm seeing a lot of middle numbers.
Yeah.
Some 3s and 4s, a few 2s, and I mean that's heartening to see that I don't see any 1s. Everybody feels like they've at least made a good stab at it here, but I see people really feel like there's room for improvement too.
I remember when we first started introducing the turtle diagram, we got the deer in the headlights look. You know, what am I supposed to do with this? You know, how am I supposed to get all this information? And
this is another tool that we'll make available to you. And people are saying, how do I get this tool? I want to be able to use this. Watch your email. Don't. And if if you don't get a letter from us in the next couple of days, if you got a letter about this webinar, then you will get the next letter that says here's where to go and grab this tool.
Great. The second graphic that they've added, and I like this one, is the Plan, Do, Check, Act graphic. Again, it's in the introduction. It's not a requirement. But one of the things that Annex SL has done for us is it's put the things that are similar in place. So instead of us having a bunch of sub clauses listed on Plan, Do, Check, Act, the actual whole clause is there now. And so they've thought through, when they put Annex SL together, they thought through the PDCA cycle. And they said, let's make this clause a plan clause. Let's make this clause a do clause, instead of having things mixed up within the clauses. And so you can see that the clause whole numbers are there, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, and they're put in the right places for the PDCA cycle. So it's a good model to help us as we go through the standard, or to help you as you explain that standard internally. what the purpose of this clause is. The purpose of this clause is the planning clause in the PDCA cycle. And here are the things that we've got to do in planning. Here's a check clause, and here are the things that we got to do in checking. So I do like this new graphic, and I think it's going to be helpful for us, especially for those of us that are doing some training. All right, the last subclause, clause, sub-clause, whatever you want to call them, deals with 442. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I think it probably deserves its own key characteristic. But I do want to talk a little bit, and we're running out of time, but I do want to talk a little bit about two words, maintain and retain. Typically, whenever we see the word maintain in front of documented information, it refers to a procedure. They've eliminated the terms procedure and records from the standard. And so whenever they say maintain documented information, they're referencing a procedure. I've only seen it about a dozen times in the standard. And then finally, retain documented information. It's mentioned a little more, probably around 20 times in the standard. And here they're referring to records. So we'll let the key concept series take it up from here and talk a little bit more about what's required from the procedure level, what's required from the records level. Do I need to renumber everything? We won't spend our time on that today. Oh, by the way, all the time we always ask, what's management's role? Do I have management that's committed? Are they the pigs? Or do I have management that's supportive? Are they the chickens? If we look at Section 5, Clause 5 in the new standard, it tells us in Bullet D that top management shall promote the use of process approach and risk-based thinking. So auditors, internal and external, will be looking for evidence that they do this. What's evidence that they're going to be promoting the process approach? Well, that process management chart could be evidence that you use. We'll talk more about the role of leadership, again, in another key concept series. And it's also an important topic that we're going to cover in our management briefing program, which Karen will talk about a little bit. We're not going to tell you so much how to get through an audit. We're going to do that, obviously, but we want to tell you how do we use this process approach to drive business improvement. That's the whole goal of this standard. You don't do it just to get the certificate. You do it to make sure your business gets better. All right, so what should we do with this information? Well, as we said with 4.3, we want to make sure that we build it into our transition, build it into the high-level plan, and build it into the actions plan. Again, we might use the matrix to help us understand what processes are going to apply to our business, and that'll be very, very useful for us in building the high-level plan and the action items. All right. Don't forget, type us some questions so we can answer them in a little bit. We're almost at 10 of, and so we'll have a little bit of time for questions. With that, I'll hand it over to Karen to give you some more information and to tell you what's next, and then we'll answer some questions. So Karen, take it away.
Thanks, Joe. I'm sure you can look down the question list and see some of those questions. I hope some more will come in. We've got a couple of good ones, and I'll repeat those out to you because they're kind of buried in amidst some of the answers to the polls that you made. Well, one of the things that I said up at the beginning was that DESERA does do training and on-site consulting for implementing ISO 9001:2015. So if you're on this call, there's a good chance that you, like I think we said, 56, 58% of the people on this call are involved in leading. I recognize a number of the names on this call and you're people with very high credentials in terms of your knowledge of quality. And yet sometimes you're just one person. You can't get around everybody and do all the training of the different types, or you need to be focusing on implementing and not on leading internal classes. So if you go to our webpage, you'll see under the training tab there, the fourth tab over, you'll see a number of the course descriptions that we have. We're offering those locally in Dallas, one course of each of the types per month in their 1 to 3 day, 2 hour to 2 day classes. You can read about them on our site, but we also offer those internally, and it really takes just 4 to 5 people to justify having a trainer come on site. And that way, when we come on site and work with your group, we can be very specific in going through exercises. Of course, we can run through the standard in a few hours, But when we come on site and work with you, or when you organize a custom distance-based learning program for your site, we can pull apart things like the is not tool or the process diagram and work examples from your own company. That's something that certification bodies can't do because they can't be perceived as consulting. So even in the course of our training, we can begin some of the consulting effort with your group. But that's the kind of thing that many of you as strong quality professionals can do with your own organization. And I hope that through the upcoming webinars, you'll get some of the information to move you along in your own education. Now, I don't know how many of you actually got caught over the Christmas break watching, man, I watched 10 hours of Making a Murderer. I binge watched that thing, man. I watched 2 or 3 episodes in a row and couldn't wait to get back to it. And that's the difference between going to webinars versus having the on-site training. Put it all in one place, go through it, see how it actually applies. But there's also advantages to doing these things a little bit at a time. And I hope everyone has a copy of the standard. So we have transition training distance or we can come on site, or you can come to the Dallas area classes. We may offer those in some different sites around the country as need be. Another thing that we do is we'll come on site and do your gap assessment. You can do it yourself. If you've got multiple sites, it's sometimes good to have an outside resource working on that with you. CVs do it, but once again, they can just give you a report. They can't give you a lot of insight on how to change things or answer a lot of questions specific to you. So we've got a link to where we describe our service for that. Transition workshops are where we come in and we work with you specifically in certain departments. Like say you've got an area that's not using the process approach. We did see that in the poll answers. That would be a place where we could go in and beef up that section of the business with you where you may not have time or you may need some outside support to get that going. And then for internal audits, most people aren't training their internal auditors yet. We're finding some of our clients are saying, come on in and audit alongside our auditors. Give them a training class. Let's get a few people up to speed, and gradually we'll transition everyone over to doing our internal audits. Or we have some clients who have completely outsourced their internal audits to us because they feel like they get a very objective report and a good check on the outside auditor and some additional expertise on the meaning behind the standard. So those are all services that Desera offers. And now I think we have a chance to get into the questions. Let's answer a couple questions and then, oh, well, this came up. Let's do the poll right here. Those are the 3 webinars we've done so far. I'll open a poll and leave it open for a little while you can answer the questions. The first, it only lets us give 5 options in a poll. So we're going to do 2 rounds of polls. Give us the 2 that you're most interested in learning more about. That'll help us stratify these results. If you really want them all and you check all of them, it's not going to give me an idea of which one to prioritize. So try to pick your top 2 on the poll that I'm launching right now. I'll leave that open for a minute or 2. See which ones of those would you be most interested, and then we'll do the second poll and we'll analyze those results separately after the webinar is over. Now you will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording of this, and you can pass that on to other people in your organization. And they can go there and pick it up. It's better if they actually register because then they get on the list and they're notified of the upcoming webinars. And we don't spam stuff. We're not into the one thing after another. We'll just notify you when we've got upcoming events or articles and stuff out there. Okay, looks like most people have voted. I'm going to close the poll in 3, 2, 1. Close the poll. Risk-based thinking is far and away the number one item on the list, followed by context of the organization and interested parties. I've got Joe is certainly expert on both of those, but I may also bring in outside perspectives on those. Many of you may know Andy Nichols. I've got him lined up to give a guest presentation. Let's see. Here's the second round. Let's look at those 5 topics. What would be your top 2 among that list of potential topics? Now, I've said that internal audits are going to need to change as a result of this standard. I don't think anybody's going to throw out their documentation out of the whole cloth, but I do think that internal auditors need to step up and maybe be higher-level people in the organization who focus more on the risks. They're more aware of the kinds of things that have gone wrong. And sure enough, oh, I guess I'm swaying the voting. I should have saved that till after. But please let us know the things that you're most interested in writing down there. And on some of these, where I see the numbers aren't coming in real high, one of the things I wonder is when somebody says, oh, well, that's not real high on my list, it kind of makes me wonder, Joe, if people are aware of some of the changes that might be in there because they haven't been the items that have gotten the high press.
Yeah, I
For
think that
example,
outsourcing, there aren't a lot of changes in terms of outsourcing. What they've done is they've put suppliers and contractors, subcontractors together. But the requirements haven't changed dramatically for outsourcing, nor have they changed dramatically for design and development. There are some minor tweaks in each of those, but they're not the
yeah,
major issues.
they're subtle. And so I think I think one of the things on outsourcing and design and development is while there may not be significant changes, I think you look at them with a different lens. And this is the kind of consulting work that we're doing with our clients. This is a chance to go back in and look at, well, what's changed? 15 years ago when ISO 9001-2000 came out, a lot of people weren't doing nearly as much outsourcing as they're doing now. Has their quality management system really kept up with it? So that's the kind of thing that might give somebody a chance to look into, gee, do we need to analyze that? Or maybe they've outsourced design and development. Maybe their company's changed in many ways. Okay, I'll close that poll and let's get on with some of the questions. So Joe, I've made a list of some of the questions here. I've copied them over onto my screen. I mentioned how do you get a copy of these tools. You will get those via an email. If it doesn't come, check your junk mail folder. One question came in I think is very interesting. Is the is-not tool enough to satisfy documentation of the scope of the QMS requirement? Okay, so what kind of documentation are we expected to have for the scope and the fact that we considered everything?
Yeah, so there is no requirement for documented information to show that you did a process for the scope. The only requirement that I read into the standard is that there is maintained documented information in the form of the scope. Tell me what the scope is. The scope typically gets reviewed by the certification body in the application, and if they have questions, they'll come back and talk to you about those questions. What you want to make sure, whatever tool you utilize, and you don't have to show them the is not. I mean, it's a methodology that you use. You don't have to show them that methodology. But whatever tool that you do utilize, you want to make sure that the quality policy, the scope, the quality objectives all work together, that there's no conflicting things in any of those, so that using the is not tool allows you to get some of that stuff fleshed out to see where there might be conflicts. From as I read the standard, there is no requirement to prove that you used some tool to develop a scope. They'll just go through the scope to assure themselves that that scope is applicable to the organization.
And that's what I was getting at on the idea of internal audits and the different kinds of skills that internal auditors need to pick up that maybe they haven't had in the past, internal and particularly third-party auditors, where they may have been able to look at a document in the past and now they need to assess a bunch of information and say, does this meet this requirement or not? It's a difficult skill to teach, and I'd be watching my external auditors to say, are they actually exhibiting this, or are they coming in and looking for everything to be written down? And make sure that your external auditors are giving a fair audit based on looking at the sum total of evidence, not just a document. Okay, the next question, we've got a couple more minutes. What instrument or data is recommended for use to justify an exclusion? Now that exclusions are eliminated, could not the organization limit the scope of the QMS and by default create a de facto exclusion? So I'm imagining there, for example, somebody who says, oh, well, we're going to take new product introduction out, even though new product introduction is very much a part of what the customer is expecting them to have included in their quality management system. So Joe, I'll repeat the question. It says, what instrument or data is recommended for use to justify an exclusion?
So let's take one. Let's take an exclusion for traceability, because that was one that people took. The only thing that I think the certification body is going to do is if you exclude traceability, then they might take a sample of your contracts and see whether or not traceability shows up in the requirements from your customer. If you wanted, again, to provide them with documentation that shows that you reviewed all your contracts for traceability, you're certainly free to do that. But as Karen suggested earlier, once you do that, all that documentation gets open to actually being looked at as part of the audit. And so in this specific instance for traceability, they're going to have to find objective evidence and that's probably going to be in your contract somewhere, where traceability is a requirement, and no, you can't exclude it because it is a requirement from one of your customers. A lot of the new requirements that we have here, because they've done away with strict procedures and they've done away with some of the records, a lot of the auditing that's going to happen is going to be looking for not so much do what you say and say what you do, but looking for effectiveness. Okay, so you have an exclusion for traceability. How effective is that? Have I seen complaints from customers that say we can't use your product because it's not traceable back to whatever? Have I seen contracts that call out traceability? So they have to dig a little bit deeper in those instances and look for effectiveness more so than do what you say and say what you do, especially if you don't provide them with that tool that you utilized.
Okay. I appreciate the questions that are coming in, even if we don't get to them today, because we will address them to the extent possible in future webinars. And I appreciate the insight into what topics you'd like in our upcoming webinars. I see we have a number of people from the telecom industry here. We will have special webinars focused on TL9000 as those changes are defined. Over the next 3 months, we are completing the revision of TL9000 to catch up to the 2015 version of ISO 9001. So with that, we're at the top of the hour, Joe. It just flew by as far as I was concerned. And I want to thank you, Joe, for speaking today. And I'd definitely like to thank everyone who called in today to participate. We welcome your email feedback. You should have an address. It may say it goes to Dave Santacola, but I read his mail all the time, and he reads mine on this kind of thing. So thanks once again, everyone, for coming. And we look forward to having you involved in our future Key Concept series. Goodbye for today.
Thank you, Karen.